Japanese people have felt the weight of our land, air, and naval attacks. Our blows will not cease until the Japanese military and naval forces lay down their arms in unconditional surrender.
By the time President Truman assumed office in April 1945, the United States was winning the war against the Japanese and moving swiftly toward a land invasion of Japan's home islands. But over 3 years of fighting in the Pacific had been every bit as perilous and costly as the war in Europe. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan captured the U.S. outposts of Guam and Wake Island, and the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore. In the Philippine Islands, Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, was ordered to flee from a Japanese invasion, leaving behind 100,000 U.S. and Filipino troops as prisoners of war. MacArthur vowed revenge.
I shall return.
U.S. forces, including 10,000 Americans and 60,000 Filipinos, pull back to the Bataan Peninsula. Without a navy to rescue them, and with their backs to the sea, they're trapped. Despite promises to the contrary, President Roosevelt and his military high command decide to focus first on Europe and on stopping Hitler. This strategy effectively seals the fate of the Philippines and the men trapped on Bataan. Under orders and against his wishes, General MacArthur escapes to Australia, vowing to return. After 4 months of fighting without supplies, starving American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese Imperial Army. It is the largest single defeat in the history of the American military. Unequipped to house or feed 70,000 prisoners of war, the Japanese take the weakened soldiers on a brutal 60-mile forced march. Men who fall out of line are bayoneted or shot. 15,000 perish on what would become known as the Bataan Death March. The surviving POWs are herded into various camps at O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, and Palawan. The Japanese guards who view surrender as a disgrace treat them viciously. Thousands die from disease, starvation, and abuse.
Despite the disastrous start, American spirits were lifted in April 1942. Colonel James Doolittle led a successful bombing run on Tokyo in a move designed to strike fear into the very heart of the Japanese.
In early May 1942, the Japanese plan to widen its defensive perimeter was launched. They seized the Solomon Islands. Two days later, the Japanese carrier force entered the Coral Sea in preparation for the main assault on Papua New Guinea. But this time, the Americans had anticipated them. Admiral Nimitz had ordered 2 U.S. aircraft carriers and a number of smaller warships into the area. For 2 days, the rival fleets searched for each other. Then, on May the 7th, U.S. aircraft located and sank the Japanese carrier Shoho. Battle of the Coral Sea was underway. Early the following day, the Japanese responded, unleashing a hail of torpedoes and bombs. To begin with, the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown managed to avoid the Japanese torpedoes. But then she took a bomb which penetrated 4 decks before exploding. 37 men were killed.
In the Battle of the Coral Sea, U.S. and Australian forces resisted an enemy attack, preventing a Japanese invasion of Australia. In June 1942, the Japanese launched a secret plan to capture a U.S. military outpost at the Midway Islands, 1,000 miles from Hawaii. But the U.S. intercepted a secret communication and sent a carrier group to ambush the approaching armada. Japan struck first. Waves of warplanes attacked U.S. forces on the island, inflicting heavy damage. The U.S. responded, sending torpedo planes and dive bombers to attack the Imperial fleet. The first squadron met fierce resistance and suffered tremendous losses. But then, within the space of an hour, the U.S. turned the tide of battle by destroying 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. By late afternoon, Japan was in full retreat. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the war with Japan. From that point forward, the United States was on the offensive. General MacArthur devised the strategy of island hopping to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. The U.S. would island hop past Japan's heavily defended islands and seize the more easily defeated outposts. There, the United States could build landing strips and employ air power to cut Japan's supply lines. By August 1944, the U.S. was island hopping steadily toward Japan, capturing Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. By October, the U.S. Navy reached the Philippines. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they fought the Japanese fleet in one of the greatest naval operations in history. The U.S. prevailed. General MacArthur had kept his promise to return. After the crushing defeat, the desperate Japanese began using what they called the Divine Wind. Kamikaze attacks. In these suicidal maneuvers, Japanese pilots dove onto Allied ships in bomb-loaded aircraft. Kamikaze attacks destroyed 36 U.S. warships, badly damaged 368 others, and killed over 5,000 sailors. But the Divine Wind failed to stop the Allied advance on Japan. President Truman set November 1945 as the date for a land invasion of Japan. But to stage the attack, the U.S. would first need to capture the heavily fortified islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
Closing in on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, the 5th United States Marine Division fires on Japanese gun emplacements studding the mountain. From Suribachi's 500-foot elevation, enemy mortars hold the entire island in range. the Navy backs up land artillery, giving cover to the 40,000 Marines fighting on shore. Slowly, the Marines push forward up Mount Suribachi. With enemy bullets inches overhead, wounded are cared for by medical corpsmen. Iwo Jima has proven the toughest, bloodiest battle the Marines have ever fought. To win this tiny 8-square-mile area, 4,000 of them have died, and 20,000 Japanese. The attack never slackens. Now Mount Suribachi is smeared by Navy dive bombers. The Marines advance. The Japanese defenders of Iwo were select, specially chosen men, fighting with their army's newest weapons and every advantage of terrain in their favor. Their fortress caves, saturating the island, are wiped out by high explosive. Iwo Jima is conquered. Only isolated snipers remain. Its airstrips are already in use by American superfortresses. Atop Mount Suribachi, this flag is 625 miles from Tokyo.
Advanced air and naval bombardments were meant to soften enemy defenses for an amphibious invasion. But once on shore, U.S. Marines were forced to fight a terrifying war of attrition. Snipers fired on the advancing soldiers from hidden entrenchments. The Marines fought back, using flamethrowers and hand grenades to destroy the underground enemy. When the last shots were fired, over 18,000 Marines had died fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. 90,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Over 100,000 Okinawans perished as well. Many of those who survived were homeless and shell-shocked. As the U.S. marched across the sea toward Japan, daily raids by American B-29 bombers were destroying Japanese cities and killing thousands of civilians. In a single firebomb attack on Tokyo, over 100,000 innocent Japanese were incinerated. For Japan, defeat was inevitable, but the island nation refused to surrender. The mounting loss of life worried President Truman. Military advisors cautioned that 250,000 American lives could be lost invading Japan. Shortly after becoming president, Harry Truman learned of the Manhattan Project, a code name for the best-kept secret of World War II. A nuclear weapon, powerful enough to destroy an entire city. Testing in the New Mexico desert proved the atomic bomb not only worked, it was even more powerful than scientists predicted. President Truman was faced with a sobering decision. Use the horrible weapon to end the war, or risk the lives of countless Allied troops in a land assault on Japan. with the urging of top aides and military advisors, Truman decided to drop the bomb on Japan. The Allies issued a final appeal to Japan's military leaders to unconditionally surrender. This was known as the Potsdam Ultimatum. Still, Japan's military leaders remained defiant. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, headed out over the Pacific toward the Japanese military center of Hiroshima. At 8 o'clock, the atomic bomb dropped clear of the plane. "43 seconds later, the city of Hiroshima was annihilated. That afternoon, President Truman again called for Japan to surrender. When Japan failed to respond, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, leveling half of the city and killing more than 60,000. By the end of the year, the death toll had reached more than 200,000 from injuries and radiation poisoning caused by the two bombs. Finally, amid scenes of unimaginable death and destruction, Japan's Emperor Hirohito capitulated.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
The war was finally over, and the world celebrated.
On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese dive bombers launched from aircraft carriers west of Hawaii struck the U.S. naval base on the island of Oahu. The bold attack immediately brought the United States into the war. The Japanese opened a brilliant campaign in Asia. In rapid succession, they seized a chain of strategic U.S. possessions in the Pacific, as well as Thailand, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Solomon Islands, and the Dutch East Indies. In February, an Allied fleet of 5 cruisers and 11 destroyers tried to intercept an Imperial force bound for Java, but was almost totally eliminated. In March, the Japanese took the Dutch colonial capital, pushed the British out of Rangoon, and invaded New Guinea. In the air-sea battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. foiled Japanese efforts to cut supply lines to Australia. But in June, Japan's wartime expansion reached its peak. Implementing a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, Admiral Yamamoto masterminded an attack on Midway Island, but the U.S. had decoded the plan. At Midway, Japan lost air superiority over the Pacific. In August, U.S. Marines established a beachhead in the easternmost part of the Indonesian archipelago. The tropical island of Guadalcanal became the scene of 6 months of savage jungle fighting. Naval forces under Admiral Chester Nimitz, along with Allied ground forces under General Douglas MacArthur, started a process of leapfrogging, the capture of key islands in a two-pronged assault on Japan. The Allies secured the Marshall Islands, then moved on to the Marianas. They overwhelmed the Japanese at Saipan and recaptured Guam. Meanwhile, General MacArthur returned to the Philippines with an invasion force. In October, the U.S. annihilated the Imperial fleet at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, then overran all resistance in the Philippines. By late 1944, B-29 bombers had begun incinerating whole cities on the Japanese mainland. Iwo Jima's capture secured the flight path from Saipan to Tokyo. In June, Americans suffered nearly 50,000 casualties in the nightmarish battle for Okinawa. The Japanese lost 100,000 dead. If the capture of tiny islands had been so deadly, what would the invasion of mainland Japan cost? To end the war immediately, President Harry Truman ordered a nuclear attack on Hiroshima. The blast destroyed the city in a single explosion. the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. Cold statistics failed to convey the tragedy of the Second World War in Asia.
Iratsia imasu. That means welcome home in Japanese to these American soldiers. After a tour of duty in Korea, they are returning to their base in Japan, where once, a short time before, they were stationed as occupation troops. And how do they return? How are they received by the people whose land they occupy? Not as overlords, not as antagonists, not as men who are distrusted and feared and resented, but as friends. The military occupation of Japan is long since over now, but this is its proof. It was an occupation without precedent in the history of the Orient, and its results are likewise unparalleled. A strong, active friendship grows out of old enmities. A bond of mutual trust and goodwill ties together the people who once were the victors and those who were the vanquished. Iratsia imasu. Said with warmth and feeling, it is a welcome that would thrill any soldier. It's a different kind of reception from the fall of 1945, when the Americans marched through the streets of Japan while the Japanese people huddled silent and frightened by their bombed-out houses. There were no cries then of welcome on their lips, and in their faces there was no sign of friendship, only fear and apprehension. How could this picture change so completely in a few years' time? What accounts for the difference? It is the difference between this, which was Japan at the end of the war, a defeated nation lying in ruins, its land gutted and scarred, many of its old modes of life uprooted, hundreds of thousands of its people lost. A nation without hope, bewildered and confused. And this, the Japan which stands today, a nation rebuilt after the years of American occupation, rededicated to democratic pursuits and realigned in friendship with the West. This is particularly important to the free world today because, again, Japan's future is the key to the future of the entire Far East. During the years of Japan's struggle for new life, the menace of Soviet aggression began to spread over the Orient. The Russians would like to include Japan in their orbit because of its location and its industrial capacity. And if they were able to take over Japan, they would soon be able to control all Asia. Toward this end, the communists in Japan have employed their usual tools of dissension and discord. The communists here are not strong, but they are noisy. They have tried to undermine Japan's security by promoting hatred of Americans. Their campaign has harvested violence, bitter demonstrations of mob passion whose purpose was to drive a wedge between the Japanese and American peoples. But in spite of the most serious efforts of the communists, Japan's ties with the United States remain strong. Those ties, made of respect and trust and cooperation, started building immediately in the occupation, when the Japanese first met the American forces and learned their purpose. They found that instead of coming as conquering masters to their homeland, the Americans came instead as friends to help the Japanese clear new paths toward peace and prosperity. To the Herculean task of rebuilding their devastated nation, the Japanese people themselves brought their native gifts of diligence, industriousness, and persistence. With a devotion that matched that of any people in the world's history, they labored hard to remove the evidences of war from their beloved land. aid them in this task, the United States brought assistance and encouragement. Japan's new constitution, compiled under American guidance, laid the framework for democracy. It gave the people the right to exercise their sovereignty through their elected representatives. As a result, the phenomenon of free elections, a condition which Americans accept as casually as they accept the air they breathe, began to appear for the first time in Japan's long history. Political parties sprang up and campaigned for their candidates in the free-swinging style of a democracy. Women were given the right to vote. Japan's new constitution brought other changes. Civil liberties were guaranteed for all persons, men and women, rich and poor. The press had always been a tightly controlled voice of the state in Japan. The militarist government before the war had used it to keep the people deluded and submissive. Under the occupation, the press was made free, and with freedom of the press came the other great freedoms of democracy, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Democracy was new and strange to the Japanese people, but they responded to its exhilarating effects with seriousness and responsibility. Another great reform brought by the occupation was the redistribution of farmland. At the end of the war, 2/3 of Japan's farmers were tenants, working land not their own, for only a small share of the crop. Today, as a result of the land reform program brought about in the occupation, 90% of Japan's farmers have a piece of land of their own. The total amount of arable land in Japan is small. The average farm is only 2.5 acres, compared to 155 in the United States. Because of this, the average Japanese farmer is not wealthy, but he tends his land carefully, conserving every precious inch of it, and the fruits of his labor are his own. He is independent, and independence was long the Japanese farmer's dream. To help rebuild Japan, the United States supplied help in tangible form, as well as political and economic guidance. During the occupation, we gave Japan more than $2 billion worth of aid, including food. For the war had all but shattered Japan's economy, and a hungry people cannot learn democratic ways very quickly. The task of reconstructing the devastated nation was slow and difficult, with many heartbreaking setbacks, like the floodwaters which rolled up from the sea carrying misery and destruction. Floods engulfed Japan in various sections, but each place the tragic story was the same. After the tides had subsided, acre after acre of carefully tended farmland lay covered. Entire communities were isolated. When catastrophe like this struck, the occupation forces rushed emergency aid to the stricken communities. The Army's Medical Corps assumed the task of pushing through whatever obstacles it could to deliver needed personnel and equipment. Nurses and doctors to care for the sick. Medical supplies to ward off disease. Food and clothing. Under the stimulus of American aid, Japan's industry began to revive, slowly at first, and often literally from scratch. Materials were scarce, but the industrious Japanese people have a great amount of ingenuity, and they accepted what little they had and built from that. The lowly tin can, for instance, discarded at American military bases and salvaged by the Japanese, became raw material in the revival of Japan's important toy industry. The sea has always been an important source of Japan's food supply, and since ancient times, her fishing fleets have been her greatest industry. In normal times, her fishermen bring in 1/4 of the world's fish products. But the end of the war found almost half the fleet sunk or out of commission, and what was left was in harbor for lack of fuel and equipment. Occupation authorities put fishing high on the list of industries needing help, and once more the coastal waters around Japan are filled with vessels, carrying fishermen who comb the sea for one of the most important staples in the Japanese diet. Japan's textile industry, including its famed silk mills, was one of the first industries to be revived. Today, although it has been hampered by diminishing markets, textiles make up nearly half of Japan's exports. Japan's heavy industry began to grow, such as the shipbuilding industry, which revived the nation's merchant fleet to carry Japan's exports into the world markets. This industrial rebirth was spurred not only by American aid, but also by Japan's own affinity for industrialization. Since the 19th century, Japan has been mastering the techniques of industrial production, matching the best records produced during the Industrial Revolution in the West. This ability once made Japan the strongest nation in all Asia, but the war set her back some 10 years behind the West in industrial techniques. She suffered from old plants and equipment and lack of contact with technical advances elsewhere in the world. But with American help, she started to catch up. Not only government help, but private American investment as well has helped Japan in this effort. Some of the United States' leading industrial enterprises, encouraged by investment incentives, have developed a private technical assistance program which is aiding Japan immeasurably. And once again, Japan is ahead of every other nation in Asia in knowledge of mass production methods. Japan became particularly important to the United States when the communist armies shook the stability of the Far East by marching on South Korea in the summer of 1950. When the free world promptly met the challenge, Japan became the base from which the United Nations directed its campaign to halt aggression. It was now that the real test of Japan's friendship for the United States came. Occupation troops left Japan for the fighting zone. At one point, every major tactical unit had left Japan. In many military occupations, this would be a dangerous situation, signaling the opportunity for uprising among the occupied people. But in Japan, there was no disturbance. The occupation proved a success. Without Japanese bases from which to move troops and equipment, the prosecution of the Korean campaign would have been much more difficult indeed. The Japanese helped our war effort, not only through their loyalty and moral support, but in a more direct way as well. Japanese industrialists turned their attention to the war needs of the United Nations, and on a competitive bid basis, undertook to produce these items. Their factories turned out equipment of all kinds for the fighting troops of the United Nations. Japanese laborers worked in United States Army plants to repair damaged military equipment. All this activity, spurred by Japan's friendship with the United States, had also a beneficial effect upon Japanese industry. The United Nations spent at the rate of $300 million a year for the military goods it bought. Related spending by United Nations forces pumped another $500 million a year into Japan's economy. Over the last few years, the Japanese people have had occasion to meet many Americans, high-ranking representatives of the United States from all walks of American life.